The summer had been unusually quiet in our neighborhood, but for me, quiet never lasted long. As chief of police in a medium-sized city just outside the suburbs, I had long grown accustomed to unpredictability, yet I found myself searching for some sense of normalcy within the walls of my own home. I thought I had earned it, really. After 25 years in law enforcement, rising through the ranks, managing crises that had put me in the crosshairs of danger and politics alike, I figured my home should be the one sanctuary where I could breathe without watching my back. But peace is a luxury, and it was one the Homeowners Association, the infamous HOA, was unwilling to grant. What began as small annoyances grew into a storm, until the line between my role as a resident and my role as chief blurred in ways I could never have imagined. The HOA, obsessed with authority and power, believed they could corner me with their petty rules, their fines, and eventually their theatrics. They had no idea who they were really dealing with, and it was that blindness, their arrogance, that would be their undoing. It all started with a letter taped crudely to my front door one sticky morning in late May. The sun was already beating down when I stepped outside to grab the paper, and there it was, flapping in the breeze as though announcing its importance to the entire cul-de-sac. The tone was familiar, the sharp, clipped sentences echoing the voice of Marjorie West, our HOA president. Marjorie was the kind of person who could make a trip to the mailbox feel like a jury summons. Everything about her screamed control, the pinched expression, the tight bun she wore like a crown, the clipboard that never seemed to leave her hand. If the devil needed a secretary, I often thought he would hire Marjorie. The letter accused me of violating the community code by parking my patrol vehicle on the street overnight. The irony wasn't lost on me. My cruiser, clearly marked with the seal of the city and parked for safety reasons while my driveway was being resealed, was suddenly an eyesore according to Marjorie's standards. The kicker was the fine, $250, payable within 10 days. I remember shaking my head and chuckling under my breath. After everything I had seen, after breaking up gang wars, after negotiating with armed suspects, here I was being fined for keeping a police car in front of my own house. That should have been laughable, but I knew better. With the HOA, the small things always snowballed into bigger ones. I tried the diplomatic route first. That same evening, I stopped by Marjorie's home, a faux brick two-story with flower beds that looked like they'd been cut from a magazine spread. She opened the door in her usual prim attire, as though she were always expecting an audience. "Marjorie," I began calmly, "I got your letter. My cruiser's only on the street temporarily. The driveway is being resealed, so it should only be a matter of days. Surely we can be reasonable about this." Her lips curved into a smile that was more warning than warmth. "Rules are rules, Chief," she said, almost savoring the irony of addressing me by my title. "If I bend them for you, I'll have to bend them for everyone. Imagine the chaos if the whole street turned into a parking lot." I wanted to tell her that order was my life's work, that chaos was something I ate for breakfast. But I bit my tongue, thanked her for her time, and left. I had seen this pattern before. Small-time tyrants clinging to their scraps of power, convinced they were generals commanding armies, when in reality they were figureheads clinging to clipboards. It wasn't about the car. It was about control. Days turned into weeks, and the letters kept coming. One claimed the grass in my backyard was a quarter-inch too long. Another insisted that the garden hose coiled neatly against the wall of my garage was a violation of aesthetic standards. Each came with a fine attached, and each one more absurd than the last. I had the sinking suspicion that Marjorie had a personal vendetta. Maybe she did not like that my position in law enforcement carried a certain respect she couldn't match. Maybe she resented the fact that neighbors waved at me with gratitude instead of fear. Whatever the reason, her campaign against me escalated quickly, and soon I wasn't the only one noticing. At the precinct, some of my officers joked about it after hearing me vent. "Chief," one of them laughed, "you would think you were hiding a meth lab in your basement the way she is treating you." I chuckled along, but deep down, I could feel the storm brewing. People like Marjorie didn't stop when they met resistance. They pushed harder. The turning point came one humid evening in June. I was grilling in the backyard, the scent of charcoal and sizzling burgers filling the air, when my neighbor Tom slipped through the gate. Tom lived 2 houses down and had always been friendly, the kind of guy who lent a hand without being asked. He looked uneasy, glancing over his shoulder before speaking. "Hey, Chief, you need to know something," he said, voice low. "I was at the HOA meeting yesterday. They were talking about you. Marjorie especially. She said you think you're above the rules, that you need to be taught a lesson." I paused, spatula frozen mid-air. "Taught a lesson? What does that even mean?" Tom shrugged. "Don't know. But the way she said it, it didn't sound like more fines. It sounded personal. Dangerous." I thanked him, assured him I'd keep my eyes open, but a chill settled in my stomach. I had dealt with criminals my whole life, but there was something uniquely unsettling about neighbors plotting behind manicured lawns and white picket fences. At least with criminals, you knew where you stood. From that night on, the tension was tangible. I noticed Marjorie's SUV driving past my house more often, sometimes slowing to a crawl as if she were cataloging every detail of my property. Other board members, once cordial at block parties, now averted their eyes when I waved. Even my mail seemed to arrive tampered with. Letters already slid open, packages mysteriously delayed. The HOA wasn't just flexing its bureaucratic muscle anymore. It was probing, testing, seeing how far it could push before I pushed back. I considered reporting the harassment formally, but the idea of the chief of police filing a complaint against his HOA felt both laughable and humiliating. No, I thought, better to wait, to let them show their hand. And show it they did. One Friday evening, I returned from a long day at the precinct to find an envelope slipped under my front door, hand-delivered this time. Inside was a final notice claiming I owed the HOA nearly $5,000 in accumulated fines. $5,000 for grass, for hoses, for parking. The letter was signed not only by Marjorie but also by the entire board. At the bottom, scrawled in pen, was a note. "Failure to comply will result in enforcement action." Enforcement action. The phrase hit me like a punch. In law enforcement, those words carried weight. They weren't just threats, they were precursors to action. But the HOA wasn't the law, so what exactly did they mean? My instincts screamed that this was bigger than fines, and as it turned out, I was right. The following day stretched into a haze of unease. Every creak outside my window, every unfamiliar car parked on the street set me on edge. I found myself slipping into cop mode even at home, scanning for threats, running through scenarios in my mind. My training told me to gather evidence, to stay patient, but the father and husband in me wanted to confront them head on. I couldn't shake the feeling that Marjorie and her board were planning something dramatic, something beyond the usual realm of HOA harassment. What I didn't know yet was that their idea of enforcement would be unlike anything I had ever imagined, and that when the moment came, their arrogance would collide headfirst with the one truth they had overlooked, the fact that I wasn't just a resident. I was the chief of police. The days following the ominous enforcement action notice were marked by an unease that I couldn't shake, a restlessness that clawed at the edges of my mind even when I tried to convince myself it was nothing more than HOA bluster. But deep down, my instincts told me otherwise. In my career as a police officer and later chief, I had learned to trust those instincts. They were rarely wrong. Something about Marjorie's phrasing had a weight to it, as though she had moved past the stage of idle threats and was preparing to act. The neighborhood itself began to feel charged, like the air before a thunderstorm. Little things kept happening, each one small enough to dismiss, but together forming a pattern too deliberate to ignore. A car idling too long at the corner, a man in a reflective vest loitering near the HOA clubhouse, neighbors who once waved now whispering as I passed. Whether paranoia or reality, It all pressed against me until my own home no longer felt secure. Still, I kept my routine, because breaking it would signal fear, and I had no intention of giving Marjorie that satisfaction. I drove to the precinct, worked my hours, signed off on reports, but every evening when I came home, I scanned the street as though returning from a stakeout. The mailbox was checked with precision, the doors double-locked, the windows secured. It was ironic, really. After years of commanding tactical units and responding to armed standoffs, here I was in my own suburban neighborhood, treating my cul-de-sac like hostile territory, and perhaps that was exactly what it had become. The first real sign that things were about to escalate came one Wednesday night. I had just settled into my chair with a cold beer, the television droning quietly in the background, when a knock rattled the front door. Not a polite tap, but a sharp, authoritative knock that immediately set me on alert. Rising slowly, I approached, peering through the peephole, and what I saw instantly prickled my suspicions. Two men stood on the porch, dressed in what at first glance looked like police uniforms. They had badges pinned to their chests, belts weighed down with equipment, and caps pulled low. But it only took me a second to notice the discrepancies. The badges were dull, lacking the shine of the real deal. The patches on their sleeves were generic, not tied to any department I recognized, and their posture screamed civilian trying too hard to mimic authority. I opened the door a crack, keeping the chain latch in place. "Evening," I said evenly, already gauging their reaction. The taller one stepped forward, his voice carrying the practiced bark of someone who had watched too many cop dramas. "Sir, we're here on official business. We need to speak with you regarding violations of community regulations. Step outside, please." My grip tightened on the door. "Violations of community regulations." No law enforcement officer would phrase it like that. "Which department are you with?" I asked calmly. The shorter man shifted uncomfortably, glancing at his partner before answering. "We're with, the County Enforcement Division." That did it. There was no such division, not in this county or any other I had worked with. They might as well have said they were from the Bureau of Lawn Aesthetics. I let a smile ghost across my lips, masking the rising anger beneath. "County Enforcement Division, huh? Interesting. Mind showing me your credentials?" The taller one reached into his pocket and produced a laminated card, flashing it too quickly for me to read. Classic rookie move. They were imposters, plain and simple, sent here under the guise of authority to intimidate me. And I had a very good idea of who was behind it. Still, I played along, feigning uncertainty. "Look, it's late," I said, keeping my tone measured. "Why don't you leave your contact information and I'll follow up tomorrow?" The taller man scowled. "That's not how this works. Step outside now or we'll have to take you in." There it was, the escalation. My pulse quickened, not out of fear, but from the adrenaline of recognizing the trap being set. They weren't just here to scare me. They were here to stage something bigger, something the HOA could use as leverage, an arrest, maybe even caught on camera, to humiliate me in front of the community. I could already imagine Marjorie smirking at the next board meeting, spinning the story about how the chief of police himself had been taken down for failing to obey the almighty HOA. But these men had made one critical mistake. They thought I was just another resident. They didn't realize I was the highest-ranking law enforcement officer in the city, trained to spot frauds and backed by the very authority they were pretending to wield. My first instinct was to tear them down right then and there, expose them for the frauds they were, but my training reminded me to think strategically. Better to let them dig their hole deeper, to collect evidence, to catch them in the act. I leaned casually against the doorframe, feigning indecision. "All right," I said finally, unlatching the chain. Their eyes lit up, convinced they had won. I stepped outside, the porch light casting sharp shadows across their counterfeit uniforms. "So, gentlemen," I said, folding my arms, "you're here to arrest me? On what charges exactly?" The shorter one fumbled with his words. "You've, repeatedly violated HOA bylaws, failure to pay fines, non-compliance, disorderly conduct in the neighborhood. I almost laughed. Disorderly conduct in the neighborhood. Was I supposed to have been rowdy while trimming my hedges? I pretended to look nervous, glancing down the street where, sure enough, I spotted Marjorie's SUV parked discreetly beneath a tree. Her silhouette was barely visible through the windshield, but I knew she was watching, waiting for the spectacle to unfold. She wanted the neighbors to see me led away, disgraced. That realization hardened my resolve. These men weren't just harassing me. They were part of a calculated plot to undermine my reputation, to strip me of authority in the eyes of the very people I swore to protect. And that I couldn't allow. The taller one reached for my arm, clearly intent on forcing me toward the curb. That's when I shifted gears. In one smooth motion, I stepped back, squared my shoulders, and let the full weight of command seep into my voice. "Gentlemen, I'll give you one chance to come clean," I said, my tone sharp as steel. "You're impersonating law enforcement, which is a felony in this state. I suggest you drop the act before you end up in a cell tonight." The words hung heavy in the air, and I saw their bravado falter. The shorter man's eyes darted nervously, but the taller one tried to hold his ground. "You can't talk to us like that. We're officers of the law." I cut him off with a barked laugh, the kind that carried the confidence of decades in uniform. "Officers of the law? You don't even know the name of the division you claim to represent. Your badges are fake, your IDs are fake, and your authority is non-existent. Do you know who I am?" I pulled my wallet from my back pocket, flipping it open to reveal my real badge, gleaming under the porch light. "I'm Chief Daniel Rourke, head of the city police department, and you two idiots just tried to arrest me on behalf of a homeowners association." For a moment, silence blanketed the porch, the absurdity of the situation crashing down on them. The shorter man paled visibly, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. The taller one, to his credit, tried to maintain composure, but his eyes betrayed him. This is a misunderstanding," he stammered, taking a step back. "A misunderstanding?" I echoed, my voice low but dangerous. "No, this is a crime. You've impersonated officers, attempted to make a false arrest, and conspired with a civilian organization to harass a public official. That's not a misunderstanding. That's years behind bars." I took a deliberate step toward them, letting my presence loom large. "Now, you're going to tell me exactly who put you up to this, or I'll call in half a dozen squad cars and have you cuffed before Marjorie can even blink from her hiding spot down the street." The mention of her name hit home. The shorter man's head snapped toward the SUV, confirming what I already knew. The taller one cursed under his breath, realizing the charade was over. For a moment, I thought they might actually confess right there, spill every detail in a desperate bid for leniency. But fear has a way of twisting decisions, and instead of talking, they bolted. Turning on their heels, they sprinted down the walkway, their fake belts clattering as they ran. I didn't chase them. I didn't need to. I already had enough. Instead, I stepped back into my house, heart pounding not from fear, but from the thrill of knowing the battle lines had finally been drawn. Marjorie had escalated to a level that could no longer be ignored. She had orchestrated a criminal impersonation of law enforcement, all to try to humiliate me. But in doing so, she had crossed into territory that was my domain, my battlefield, and she had no idea the storm she had unleashed. When the two imposters bolted from my porch that night, their cheap uniforms flapping behind them, I knew the game had changed. They had overplayed their hand, and I finally had leverage. But leverage in my world was never something to flaunt carelessly. It had to be applied with precision, with patience, the way a seasoned detective waits for the right moment to flip a suspect. The temptation to march straight down the street, drag Marjorie from her SUV, and confront her in front of the neighbors was strong. God knows she deserved it. But that would have given her exactly what she wanted, a spectacle. Instead, I closed the door, sat at my kitchen table, and began planning. The first step was documentation. Over the years, I had trained countless officers to think like investigators, and now it was my turn to practice what I preached. I retrieved the small security camera I kept mounted near the porch light and played back the footage. The video showed the imposters clearly, their faces illuminated under the bulb, their cheap badges catching just enough glare to prove their falseness. Even better, the audio was crisp. Every word of their ridiculous charges, every threat they had tried to level against me, was preserved. I backed up the file to multiple drives and sent a copy to my work email. Evidence, secured and untouchable. The next step was to identify them. Impersonators rarely operate in a vacuum. These men weren't professionals. They were too sloppy, too poorly trained. They had likely been hired, perhaps even recruited from some corner of the community. My suspicion was that Marjorie had found them through her endless network of busybodies and self-important acquaintances, people desperate for a little taste of authority. I replayed the footage again, pausing at their faces, committing every detail to memory. Tomorrow, I would run them through the city's facial recognition system, discreetly, of course. I wasn't about to put an official case number on this, not yet. The moment I did, it would leak, and Marjorie would know I was onto her. No, this had to stay quiet, at least until I could gather enough rope to hang the entire HOA with one pull. Still, secrecy didn't mean solitude. That evening, I called Tom, the neighbor who had first warned me of Marjorie's scheming. He arrived 20 minutes later, a six-pack in hand, his brow furrowed with concern. I showed him the footage, watched as his eyes widened in disbelief. "Holy hell," he muttered. "She really went through with it." He shook his head, pacing across my kitchen. "This is insane, Chief. I mean, hiring fake cops? What's next? Is she going to start her own militia?" I allowed myself a grim chuckle. "Wouldn't put it past her," I said. "But this works in our favor. She's crossed into criminal territory now. Impersonating law enforcement, attempted false arrest. That's serious. Once I have proof she orchestrated it, she's finished." Tom exhaled, clearly relieved. "So what's the plan?" I leaned back in my chair, fingers steepled. "The plan is to let her think she's winning. People like Marjorie thrive on perception. If she believes she's rattled me, she'll double down, make more mistakes. Meanwhile, I'll be gathering evidence, building the case. When the time comes, we won, to just stop her, we'll expose the entire rotten structure she built." The following days, I slipped into a routine that was equal parts cop and chess player. At the precinct, I quietly ran the faces of the two imposters through our systems. It didn't take long to get hits. The taller one was a man named Rick Dolan, a part-time security guard with a record of minor infractions. Disorderly conduct, trespassing, nothing major, but enough to suggest a taste for playing tough guy. The shorter one was Kevin Marsh, unemployed, known around town for odd jobs, and a brief stint as a mall security officer. Neither had law enforcement training, but both clearly had egos big enough to wear a fake badge. Their addresses were local, their connections shallow. But what tied them to Marjorie? That was the puzzle piece I needed. I started asking quiet questions. Not official interrogations, just casual conversations with colleagues who might have crossed paths with Dolan or Marsh. One officer remembered seeing Dolan at a local community event last year, an event sponsored by, of all things, the HOA. Another recalled Marsh attending one of Marjorie's so-called neighborhood safety seminars, where she preached about vigilance and order as though she were running her own mini-police academy. The threads were connecting, and the tapestry they wove all pointed back to the same source. Marjorie had groomed these men, fed their delusions, and unleashed them on me like attack dogs. Meanwhile, life in the neighborhood grew stranger. I noticed neighbors avoiding me more openly now, their conversations cutting short when I approached, their gazes sliding away. Rumors were spreading, no doubt planted by Marjorie and her loyalists. She wanted to isolate me, to strip me of credibility so that when her version of events came out, people would already be inclined to believe it. But she underestimated one thing. People talk. And sometimes they talk to the wrong person. It was late one evening when I got a call from Linda, another neighbor, a woman I'd always known to be sensible and fair. She spoke in hushed tones, clearly nervous. "Chief, I thought you should know. Marjorie's been holding secret meetings at the clubhouse. Not the regular HOA stuff, something else. She calls them strategy sessions. I overheard her telling people you're dangerous, that you're abusing your position. She even said she has evidence." My jaw tightened. Evidence. I hadn't done anything to warrant such a claim, which meant she was manufacturing it. Fake documents, doctored photos, maybe even staged incidents. Marjorie was willing to go all in. I thanked Linda, reassured her she had done the right thing, and hung up. My mind raced. If Marjorie was fabricating evidence, she was laying the groundwork for something bigger, something public. The fake arrest attempt had been step one. Step two would be character assassination, turning the neighborhood against me completely. Step three, who knew? But whatever it was, I couldn't let it reach that point. That night, I sat at my desk, files spread across the surface, the glow of the desk lamp illuminating notes and screenshots. This wasn't just about defending myself anymore. It was about exposing corruption, about showing the community that the HOA wasn't a Tia guardian of order, but a parasite feeding on fear. I felt the old fire burning in my chest, the same fire that had driven me through years of police work. The difference was, this time the battlefield wasn't the streets of the city, it was my own neighborhood. By the end of the week, I had compiled a dossier thick enough to rival a case file. Photos of Dolan and Marsh in their fake uniforms, their criminal records, records of their attendance at HOA events, testimonies from Tom and Linda, both willing to speak out if needed, video footage from my porch, crystal clear. All that remained was tying Marjorie directly to the scheme. That was the missing link, the nail that would pin her to the wall, and then, as if on cue, opportunity arrived. Late Saturday night, I spotted Dolan's car parked near the clubhouse. Lights glowed from inside, shadows moving across the blinds. I parked discreetly at the end of the street and watched through binoculars. There she was, Marjorie, standing at the front of the room, clipboard in hand, addressing a small group of people. Dolan and Marsh were there too, seated like loyal foot soldiers. I couldn't hear the words, but the body language told me everything. She was leading them, instructing them. This wasn't an HOA meeting. It was a cabal, a council of petty tyrants plotting their next move. I snapped photos, careful to capture faces, timestamps, context. This was gold. With this, I could already make a case, but I wanted more. I wanted her on tape, her voice sealing her fate. And so I decided on the next step. Infiltration. Not the kind that involved disguises or secret identities. I was too well known for that. But technological infiltration. A hidden recorder, a well-placed camera, something to capture the poison dripping from her own lips. As I drove home that night, the plan crystallized in my mind. The trap was set. Marjorie thought she was tightening her grip, but in reality, she was walking straight into the jaws of her own undoing. And when the jaws snapped shut, there would be no escape. The neighborhood seemed quieter in the days following my decision to set the trap, but it was the deceptive kind of quiet that carried an undercurrent of tension. To anyone else, it may have seemed like life had returned to normal. Lawns were trimmed, sprinklers hissed in the evening air, children rode bikes down the cul-de-sac. But I knew better. I had spent too many years reading the subtleties of human behavior not to recognize the weight of unspoken words, the nervous glances between neighbors, the way conversation stopped just a fraction too quickly when I walked past. Marjorie's hold over the HOA had created an atmosphere of unease, and her attempt to humiliate me with those imposters had revealed just how far she was willing to go. What she didn't realize was that she had already crossed the line from petty tyranny into outright criminality, and I wasn't about to let her crawl back across it. That Saturday, under the cover of night, I prepared my counteroffensive. Technology has always been one of law enforcement's quietest allies, and I had access to tools that could record, document, and preserve evidence in ways Marjorie couldn't even imagine. I installed a discreet camera in my mailbox, one with a wide angle that captured not only the street, but also the entrance to the clubhouse. I also placed a small recorder inside an inconspicuous flower pot near the pathway leading to the HOA's meeting hall. The devices were nearly invisible to the casual eye, and with them, I hoped to capture the damning proof of Marjorie's scheming in her own words. It didn't take long. On Sunday evening, as dusk settled and fireflies flickered across the lawns, I sat in my car down the block with a live feed streaming to my phone. Through the camera's grainy lens, I watched members of the HOA board file into the clubhouse one by one. Dolan and Marsh arrived together, their swagger muted, shoulders hunched like men ashamed yet too committed to turn back. And then Marjorie appeared, clipboard under her arm, her expression tight with self-importance. She carried herself like a general leading troops into battle, blissfully unaware that the very ground beneath her was rigged against her. The audio recorder picked up her voice clearly once the meeting began. "We cannot allow him to win," she declared, her tone sharp and commanding. "If he thinks he can intimidate us just because of his badge, he is gravely mistaken. The bylaws exist to maintain order, and we will enforce them by any means necessary. Rick, Kevin, you two did well, but we need another attempt. This time, it must look official. No mistakes." Hearing her say it, hearing her not only admit but direct the impersonation, sent a surge of vindication through me. This was it, the smoking gun. She wasn't just guilty by association. She was the architect of the scheme. And the best part? Every word was being recorded. I let the meeting continue, resisting the urge to march in and slap cuffs on her then and there. Timing was everything. I wanted her to believe she was untouchable right up until the very moment the trap closed. Only then would the fall hit her with full force. When the meeting finally ended and the board members filed back into the night, I retrieved the devices and secured the files. By the time I returned home, my case was ironclad. The following morning, I assembled a small, trusted team at the precinct. Officers I had worked with for years, men and women whose integrity was beyond question. In the briefing room, I laid out the evidence, the video of Dolan and Marsh on my porch, the identification records tying them to Marjorie's circle, the photos of the clandestine meeting, the audio recording of her issuing direct orders. One by one, my officers' expressions shifted from disbelief to outrage. Finally, one of them, a seasoned sergeant named Hayes, leaned back and let out a low whistle. "Chief, this isn't just an HOA spat. This is conspiracy, impersonation of law enforcement, coercion, harassment, the works. She's cooked." "Exactly," I said. "But we're not just going to arrest her quietly. People like Marjorie thrive on perception. If we handle this behind closed doors, she'll spin it, claim she's the victim of a personal vendetta. No, we're going to do this by the book, out in the open, with every T crossed and every I dotted. When we move, the whole neighborhood will see it. They'll see the truth, and they'll know exactly who's been poisoning their community." The plan was set for Friday evening. By then, the neighborhood would be bustling. Families outside, joggers making their rounds, children playing in driveways. It would be the perfect stage for the revelation. My officers would move in discreetly at first, positioning themselves near the clubhouse during the HOA's weekly meeting. At my signal, they would enter, serve the warrants, and escort Marjorie and her co-conspirators out in full view of the community. Transparency was key. This wasn't just about justice. It was about restoring faith, tearing down the illusion of power Marjorie had built brick by brick. When Friday arrived, the air hummed with anticipation. I spent the day at the precinct, reviewing every detail of the operation, ensuring no stone was left unturned. By late afternoon, I drove home, the weight of the moment pressing down on me. This wasn't just another arrest. This was personal, a battle fought not on the streets of the city, but on the sidewalks of my own neighborhood. As the sun dipped low, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, I dressed in my uniform, not the casual attire of a resident, but the full regalia of the chief. Badge gleaming, stripes on my sleeve, authority radiating from every polished button. If Marjorie wanted a spectacle, I would give her one, but not the kind she had envisioned. At exactly 7 o'clock, my radio crackled with the signal. The HOA meeting was underway. I stepped out of my house, the cool evening air brushing against my face, and walked down the street with steady, deliberate strides. Neighbors turned their heads, conversations faltering as they watched. Some looked curious, others uneasy, but all eyes followed me as I made my way toward the clubhouse. By the time I reached the entrance, 2 of my officers had already taken position at the side doors, another at the back. I nodded, and together we pushed inside. The room fell silent the moment I entered. Marjorie stood at the head of the table, mid-sentence, her expression freezing as her eyes locked onto mine. Dolan and Marsh shifted uncomfortably in their seats, clearly recognizing the storm about to break. Around the table, board members glanced nervously at one another, unsure of what was happening. "Good evening," I said, my voice carrying the authority of command. "I apologize for the interruption, but I believe this meeting is about to take a very different turn." Marjorie recovered quickly, her face hardening. "Chief Rourke, this is a private HOA meeting. You have no jurisdiction here. Please leave." I allowed myself a thin smile. "On the contrary, Marjorie, this meeting is no longer private. It's the scene of an ongoing investigation." I reached into my pocket, producing a stack of documents, and laid them on the table. "These are warrants for the arrest of Rick Dolan and Kevin Marsh on charges of impersonating law enforcement and attempted false arrest, and this," I tapped another paper, "is a warrant for your arrest. Marjorie West, on charges of conspiracy, harassment, and criminal solicitation." Gasps rippled through the room. Marjorie's face drained of color, then flushed red with fury. "This is outrageous," she spat. "You can't arrest me. I'm the president of this association." I stepped closer, my gaze unwavering. "You're not above the law, Marjorie. You never were. You thought you could twist rules and wield fear like a weapon. But tonight, it ends." At my signal, officers moved in. Dolan and Marsh didn't resist, their bravado long gone, replaced by the hollow look of men who knew the game was over. Marjorie, however, erupted. She kicked her chair back, jabbing a finger at me. "This is a setup. He's doing this because I dared to challenge him. You're all witnesses. He's abusing his power." But even as she shouted, her voice cracking with desperation, I reached into my bag and pulled out a small speaker. With the press of a button, her own voice filled the room. "Rick, Kevin, you two did well, but we need another attempt. This time, it must look official. No mistakes." The recording echoed through the clubhouse like a hammer blow. Board members froze, eyes wide, the weight of her guilt undeniable. Marjorie's face contorted, her words faltering as the realization sank in. She had been caught, exposed in her own hubris. I gave a final nod, and 2 officers stepped forward, cuffing her wrists as the neighborhood's most feared figure was led from the room.